Everyone, thanks for coming along. It's great to get the pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks, Patricia. That was really inspiring. Thank you. Well, most of my life, unlike Patricia's and Andrew's, I think, has been spent researching, writing and teaching Australian history, both here and overseas. I've written national political histories, regional histories, biography, and recently a quarterly essay, Moment of Truth, History in Australia's Future. And I guess, during all this time, all of this writing, I've probably been trying to understand one question more than any other, and that is the relationship between our past and our present, and how acknowledging our history, understanding our history differently, might have a real impact on some of these things we're talking about today, such as peace, citizenship, and international relations. Some years ago, I wrote a book called Looking for Blackfellas Point. And that's because in the early 90s, I bought 10 acres of land inland from Eden on the far south coast of New South Wales. And I was living in Sydney at the time. I purchased that land as a retreat, I think, at the time. Some kind of, you hear people say, I have to get out of Sydney. But over time, buying that land, I came to see how little I actually knew about the Aboriginal history of that region and that place where I'd bought land. It had been occupied for thousands of human generations by Aboriginal people, and yet at the same time I found that difficult to access, that past and that history. And I was surrounded by an area with so many Aboriginal names. Some of these places you may have been to: Pambula, Merimbula, Bega. The map is full of Aboriginal names, but I realised I knew very little about that Aboriginal history. So that book, Looking for Blackfellas Point, is really it begins with my own ignorance. How can I actually learn more about that region? And at the time, Australia was going through a really divisive political debate about the stolen generations. You might recall in the late 90s, whether to apologise or not. And I could see all of those issues magnified in that local community. So what I was trying to do in that book was to connect the local to the regional, to the national, to the international, to show the connections between all of those different spheres, because so often we see them as separate. And I guess one of the big things I learnt was that there is no history of Australia that's non-Aboriginal. As soon as Europeans arrive, Aboriginal history becomes part of European history becomes part of Aboriginal history. And when I look back, when that book was published in 2002, I think I'd describe the interest at the time in Indigenous history as boutique. Intense, but boutique. And there's been a real change, a real shift. And why is that? Over the last 20 years, I think. First, I think we're starting to become more interested, more fascinated by the way in which Indigenous people relate to the land. Not only because of historical reasons, but because of environmental reasons. We want to understand how they managed the country. So one of the big insights recently has been that we've started to realise, of course, that when Europeans arrived here in the late 18th century, this land was already managed carefully managed by Aboriginal people. Whereas, of course, at the time it was believed that they were not managing the land, that they were just wandering around. So environmental reasons, cultural reasons, also in fiction, in novels, in film, on radio, in documentaries. There's a growing interest in that cross-cultural encounter between Aboriginal people and Europeans. In my last book, I wrote about an incredible story of the walk of 17 shipwreck survivors. The ship was wrecked down in Bass Strait in 1797, just off the northeast coast of Tasmania, near Flinders Island. And they sent 17 of their best people in a longboat, which is no bigger than a surf boat, to make it to Sydney, which was then a town of only 1,500 people, to get help. That longboat was wrecked on 90 Mile Beach in Victoria, and those 17 people, 12 of whom were Indian, set out to walk to Sydney. 700 kilometres. Imagine, 1797. Few of us would make it, I think, if we tried it ourselves today. And there's a journal of one of the walkers that was kept along the way, and it was remarkable to me that no one had tried to tell this story until I picked it up. And I realised one of the reasons why it wasn't told, despite the fact that journal existed, was because you had to walk the country. You had to actually go out there and walk at least parts of the journey that they undertook. And they passed through 10 different Aboriginal territories, 10 different languages. And after 3 of them, by the way, I should tell you, won't keep you in suspense, 3 made it to Sydney. And one of the things they realised, one of the survivors realised as they kept going, was that the land they'd seen from a ship, if you imagine seeing country from a ship, you see it en masse. You don't see it differentiated. But as they walked the country and they heard different languages, they started to see that this country that they thought was just, quote, inhabited by natives, was actually broken into specific territories. As they walked, they could see that. That was a really startling revelation in 1797 for those men who walked that distance to Sydney. So those kinds of stories are the kinds of histories that I've been grappling with over the last 20 years especially. And that brings me to my quarterly essay, because I guess one of the questions I'm trying to ask is, well, what good is this history potentially? And I think there are dangers in freighting too much expectation onto history. But what role can history play now in our communities, in our nation's public life, in our political life, in our everyday life? Well, like many of you, I wrote that quarterly essay because I was dismayed by the government's rejection in late 2017 of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, does everyone know what the Uluru Statement from the Heart is? Yeah. It came out of a long process of negotiation around the country in different Aboriginal communities who met at Uluru and convened and decided that they wanted a voice to Parliament. They wanted to establish a permanent Indigenous body which would be a voice to Parliament. And one thing that's really important to realise, because this will be, I guess, talked about during the election campaign, is that what they proposed when that statement left Uluru was that the principle of the voice to Parliament would be enshrined in the Constitution. At the moment, Aboriginal people are largely invisible in our Constitution, invisible. So they want to create a recognition of Indigenous people, and they want to do that through this idea of a voice. But it's only the principle of the voice that will be enshrined. Its workings will be left to Parliament. That's really important. The other thing that they recommended was a Truthtelling Commission. Truth-telling about Australia's history. And I'll say a little bit about that perhaps later in when we've got some time in discussion, what that truth-telling might mean. It was said that this was a radical idea at the time. It was said it would be a third chamber of Parliament. Watch out, you can't have a third chamber of Parliament. Of course, there's no such thing. It's an advisory body. Even Alan Jones, the Sydney shock jock, thought that it was a good idea. So it's clearly not radical if Alan Jones supports it. And I think the government's rejection at the time of the Uluru Statement shows that Australia lacks a treaty-making culture. We lack a culture of negotiating with Aboriginal people as equals. We haven't established that yet. And that's one of the challenges in the years ahead. If you go to Canberra and you stand in the vast empty space between the National Library and Questacon, and you're looking straight up towards Old Parliament House and behind it, Capitol Hill, New Parliament House. If you look around, if you imagine yourself as an overseas visitor, you can see very quickly that there is very little obvious presence of Indigenous Australia in that parliamentary triangle. There is a tent embassy, which is not invited, and it's been there since 1972. And there is a place called Reconciliation Place, which is very small. But there is no architectural statement, presence, national institution that would showcase Aboriginal culture, be a keeping place for ancestral remains perhaps, be a positive statement, and also there is no memorial. There is no memorial to those who lost their lives on the frontier wars. There's a silence about that in our parliamentary triangle. So when you stand in Canberra, you realise we've struggled. We've struggled to bring Aboriginal people, to include Aboriginal people in our vision of what this country can be. And Canberra is the crowning example of that silence. So what I tried to argue in the essay was that at a fundamental level, we've failed to see, we've failed to hear, we've failed to listen to what Indigenous people are asking of us as Australians. Now, it's good that Ros asked me to talk to the themes of music as well, and international citizenship and peace, because it's important to remember that the Uluru Statement, which is a text, of course, right? It was handed to the government came from Uluru, handed to the government. It has artistic and cultural dimensions as well, not just political. We should remember that Uluru, after all, is a World Heritage site, has been since 1987. And I think this Uluru Statement will actually hang in Parliament House one day, just like other statements from Aboriginal people have currently hang in Parliament House. But the text of the Uluru Statement was accompanied by dance. It was gift-wrapped, if you like. It was gift-wrapped in Aboriginal art, in dance and song. The artist Renee Kulicha from Mutijulu, which is the community near Uluru, painted the bulk of the canvas around the text, which was presented to the federal government. So just imagine a huge canvas with the text of the statement in the middle and an Aboriginal artwork around it. And interestingly, Renee, the artist, is also a member of the Central Australian Aboriginal Women's Choir, which has actually transposed traditional Lutheran hymns to Pitjantjatjara and Arrernte, Central Australian languages, which has toured Europe and the USA. This is what she has to say about the Uluru Statement. I think a lot about the two worlds that we live in now, the non-Aboriginal world, the whitefella world, the mainstream world, and our cultural world. I think about how is it possible to work within both worlds? How do we bring them together so we support one another and understand both worlds? The Uluru Statement travelled around Australia, gathering signatures as well. There was an exhibition of art here in Sydney, launched by Rachel Perkins, which had 12 Aboriginal artists from Central Australia, all doing work related to the Uluru Statement. And when it was actually signed at Uluru in May 2017, there were all sorts of Indigenous important Aboriginal rituals associated with that. For example, the delivery of a fighting stick to the government as well, shields, baskets, art. There were ceremonial dances, both at the beginning of the convention and at the close. Now, it's interesting because, of course, it's not only Aboriginal art, music, dance, that is associated with Uluru. After all, non-Indigenous Australians have also created musical works about Uluru. Peter Sculthorpe, I think, Andrew will know this better than me. There's quite a few classical composers, Ross Edwards, I think, as well, who've written works about Uluru. Even there was a rock band in the 80s called Goanna, Spirit of the Rock, I think it was called. So we too have been creating artworks around Uluru, just like Aboriginal people, but in different ways, of course. And why is this important to us today? Okay, I'm standing here talking about the Uluru Statement as a statement of the political, which it is, of course. In fact, it's probably the most visionary political document to come out of this country in the last 2 decades at least, without doubt. If you have not read it, I urge you to read it. You can find it easily. Just Google Uluru Statement. You can bring up a PDF. It's one of the most poetic distillations of the demand that Aboriginal people have of the state and our constitution. But if we start to see that artwork and dance and music around the Uluru Statement, then we start to see it differently. We start to see that the question that's being asked of us is not just to vote yes in a referendum to this proposal, but to actually embrace a whole different way of thinking about the country, to embrace Indigenous knowledge, culture, art, so that that political statement is grounded in, fundamentally grounded in, a broader view of the world, which touches also, of course, our international obligations under the conventions we've signed for the United Nations. Now, I could go on, but I won't, because the essay, as I said, is about truth-telling, the Republic, and so on, and I'm happy to answer questions about those things. But thanks for listening.